So first of all, today we will be celebrating the webinar Renewables Permitting Framework in the European Union, and we'll be talking, or Marta Andres Vaquero will be talking about challenges and opportunities. So first of all, I would just like to quickly introduce Marta. She works in the Unit C1, in the Renewables and Energy System Integration Policy in the European Commission. She has worked on several legislative initiatives, in particular the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. My name is Marián Aúz. I'm account executive for the DACH region at RatedPower. And yeah, as mentioned, I am responsible for the accounts in the DACH region at the moment. So yeah, Marta, if you want, the floor is yours, and we'll be happy to hear your insights. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Marián, and good afternoon, everyone from sunny Brussels for a change. Very happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar to discuss this very important topic of permitting, how administrative procedures and permitting impact renewables deployment across Europe, what are the challenges that we are facing now, and possible solutions, and how we can actually tackle this issue and accelerate the deployment, the very much needed deployment of renewables in the coming years by simplifying permitting bottlenecks and permitting issues. So if you allow me, I will start by giving a bit of an overview of what I will be talking about today. I don't know how much knowledge the audience has with the European legislation in the field of not only renewables but permitting in particular. So I may give a few general ideas about that, but I will also try to dig a bit deeper into the details. So I'll try to reconcile both. I will focus on two instruments, on two legal instruments, so two European laws that have been recently either adopted or are still negotiated, and that will try to simplify and accelerate permitting for renewables. One of them was a regulation that was adopted at the end of last year in December 2022, and the other one is the Renewable Energy Directive. The current version of this directive is actually from 2018. But now it has been negotiated. We have decided a few years ago to propose to update this directive, not only to meet our new, more ambitious energy and climate targets, but also in view of the Ukrainian war last year. It was decided to try to promote and to accelerate much more the deployment of renewables. So that's why this revision of the directive actually comes in a very pertinent moment to try to actually achieve this acceleration. And at the end, we will have some time for some questions and answers, and I will be happy to discuss if there is any question at the end. So moving on, I would like to start with a bit of context. So trying to indeed set a bit the big picture of where we are right now in terms of renewables deployment, and also in terms of permitting challenges and how permitting is a bottleneck to achieve our very ambitious objectives for renewables. So as I said, the main European law or main European legislation for renewables deployment in Europe is the Renewable Energy Directive. So this directive was adopted in 2018 and is the one that is currently in force. So this directive basically imposes an obligation that all the member states have to achieve a target of 32% of renewables in the European Union energy mix by 2030. So this is the target that we currently have under this directive. But as I said, we decided to do a revision of this directive because this was not ambitious enough, given our very ambitious climate targets in the context of the European Green Deal and the objective to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 and all the international obligations that the European Union and the member states have. So this was not ambitious enough. So there was this process of reviewing this directive, and we have been we have been in legislative negotiations with the European co-legislators, so with the Parliament and the Council, and we have recently reached a few months ago an agreement on a revised Renewable Energy Directive. But I have to insist that whatever I'm going to say now on this directive is still provisional, because this directive still has not been formally validated, and it still has to be, it has to go under or through a process of checks, and there will be some fine-tuning of the text. But normally the agreement has been provisionally agreed, and we expect that this new directive, which is much more ambitious, will be adopted in the next months, ideally after the summer, not long after the summer. So this new Renewable Energy Directive imposes a much more ambitious target to achieve collectively in the whole EU a share of 42.5% of renewables in our energy mix by 2030. And with an aspiration, so with an additional, let's say, voluntary top-up to reach 45%. But the mandatory level, the compulsory level that all member states have to achieve is 42.5 in the EU. This is very ambitious, so we really need to accelerate the deployment of renewables. Just to put things into perspective, in 2021, so basically almost now, the level of renewables in the EU is around 22%. So this target basically means that we need to almost double the share of renewables in our energy mix in 8 years, because of course 2030 is not so far away. So as I said, this is ambitious, but we think this is realistic and this is doable, and we are already seeing record numbers on the ground. So for instance, 2022 was a record year in terms of deployment. We had 16 gigawatt new wind capacity installed and 41 gigawatt new solar capacity installed. And these actually represent an increase of 45 and 47% respectively compared to the previous year for both wind and solar. So we do see already record numbers, and we need to maintain these very good trends, and we actually need to increase them. But not only renewables need to be accelerated, but also the power grid. I mean, to basically accommodate all this new production capacity, all these new renewables on the ground, we also need to be able to accommodate and to integrate these new renewables into the grid. So that's why we need also to think about expanding the grid to be able to accommodate all these. So this is why we need to address also the permitting issue, both for the renewable projects, but for the grid expansion as well. So if we think about what are the main key permitting challenges that projects face, what we have seen and what we found out in studies and talking to stakeholders, etc., is that permitting has been identified as one of the main bottlenecks that renewable projects are actually facing. Both for the renewable projects, but also for the grids. And you can think of long procedures in terms of when dealing with the national administration. Sometimes many processes are actually not electronic yet, so there is still a lot of a significant amount of paperwork that has to be done. There are also several parallel procedures with different authorities with limited internal coordination among themselves. So you can think of the environmental process, so the environmental approvals, but also safety or technical checks or the grid connection part. So many different steps in a same process, and sometimes these are not really well coordinated. So this is also an important bottleneck. We also saw that an issue or one important challenge is the lack of planning or the lack of spatial planning for renewable projects. And this is one of the points in which this reform of the Renewable Energy Directive has really focused. So we really insist on the importance of good spatial planning, so that in the different member states there is a good strategic planning, so that the territory is identified in terms of good areas for deployment of renewables, or what areas give rise to less conflicts with other goods, such as environmental protection or biodiversity or other uses such as agriculture, etc. We also see an issue, that another issue is, of course, the lack of skills and the lack of actually human resources in the national administrations. So this is an important point where member states actually need to devote more efforts to both streamline processes, but also ensure that they have enough people to actually deal with the procedures. Citizen involvement is also a very important point in this regard. So as I said, we are insisting on strategic planning. So the importance of doing this mapping of the territory, and in this process we want member states to involve citizens from the very beginning, so that there is a consultation process when member states look at their territory and see, well, this is a good area for solar, this is a good area for wind, and then they start consulting the public early on in the identification of these areas that are good for the deployment of renewables, and that are maybe there are less conflicts with the environment in these areas. Another issue, another point that we have seen for improvement is the long waiting time for the grid connection permits. So this is the context, this is a bit the background that has led us to act. And from the EU, or at the EU level, there have been several steps. So at the beginning, we started last year, 1 year ago, issuing simply a recommendation. So some sort of voluntary guidance document for member states to speed up permitting. So this is a document that is actually available in our website. So it can be read. It gives like an idea, or it's well, good ideas and good tips on good best practices from member states on what are good permitting procedures. But we realized that only with a recommendation, this was not really strong enough to address these challenges. So that's why we adopted some legal texts with obligations on member states. And these are the two that I mentioned. This regulation adopted last year, and the Renewable Energy Directive that still not in force, but will be adopted soon. So I will start talking about the regulation. I will explain a bit what this legal instrument is, and what it is about and what it covers. This was a regulation, a law that was adopted last year under a very, very fast procedure. So it was rather exceptional. And it was done in the context of other exceptional legislation that was adopted at the EU level in the context of energy, also to address the high prices, the prices crisis, etc. As a result of the war in Ukraine. So we saw that we needed to act in several fields, and one of them was for renewables, because we realized that we really need a fast deployment and an acceleration of the deployment of renewables, also to counter a bit the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of energy independence and energy security. Renewables are crucial, so they are very important not only for our climate objectives, but also in terms of ensuring our energy independence and not to depend so much on Russia. So we adopted this regulation, which is temporary, so it's only valid for 18 months. And the main reason for this is that afterwards, we will have the Renewable Energy Directive that I will explain also in a second. It will be the main law, let's say. But in the meantime, and until the directive is in place, we have this temporary regulation. It is already applicable. And an important thing to mention is that what is in this regulation is already member states already have to apply it in their different national territories. So they have to directly apply all these obligations. And what it contains is very targeted rules to boost the deployment of certain specific technologies, renewable technologies and types of projects that have the potential to achieve very quick wins, let's say, so a quick deployment and to already accelerate a lot. So it is not a surprise to hear that a focus of this regulation was on solar deployment, in particular solar on artificial structures. And installation of solar equipment by self-consumers as well, because of course this is where citizens can really participate in the energy transition themselves, and this can be done in a quick and faster manner, much faster than if we think, for instance, of the creation of an offshore wind farm. So this is, of course, something that can be done much faster. Also, the deployment of heat pumps. So everything that can be done, let's say, at the local level by citizens themselves, it's something that is really being pushed and promoted by this legislation. This regulation also focuses on repowering. So not the new projects, not the big new, solar parks or wind farms, but the repowering of the existing ones, because this is something where there are important synergies. This can be done very fast. The repowering, we already have the project. Normally, you just replace the panels by newer, more efficient ones, or the wind turbines, they can be replaced by new turbines, much more efficient. So, but there is already some synergies that you already know the impacts of the project on the ground. People are already familiar with this project, so it is, let's say, much faster or much more efficient than setting up a new project from scratch. So this legislation wants to facilitate also the repowering of projects, and there are some provisions too for the deployment of, or facilitating the deployment of the grids. But I will focus in this presentation simply on the solar point and on the repowering point. I think those are going to be more interesting today. So in terms of solar equipment, this legislation imposes maximum deadlines for the installation of solar equipment in artificial structures. And what is an artificial structure? It is those structures that are already in place, but that they are not aimed at producing energy. So any building that is already there, offices, factories, industry, anything that is already there and that is not being set up on purpose for the purpose of producing energy. So solar, grounded, or the solar parks that are grounded on the ground, those would not be included, but the installation of solar panels and solar equipment on any artificial structure that you can think of would be covered. And here we have imposed a very quick permitting deadline, so a maximum of 3 months. So member states, all the authorities have to approve this within a maximum of 3 months. We have also introduced a derogation from the obligation to do an environmental impact assessment if this is applicable in the national level. So for these installations of solar panels, there is no obligation to do an environmental impact assessment if they are installed in artificial structures. And the logic of this is that, of course, if you already have a building, or if you already have a hotel or a parking or factories, then there are already important synergies. If you just put solar panels on top, there is no additional impacts on the environment. So all these procedures should be very quick. We also put additional acceleration of the permitting for the very small scale installations of solar with a threshold up to 50 kilowatt. So here the permitting rules are even faster. So instead of 3 months, it's 1 month deadline. And with the concept of positive silence, which basically means if the authority does not reply within 1 month, it means that the permit is authorized, that they give the permit, so you can proceed with installation. Of course, there are some safety conditions and some exceptions to these. So we need to make sure that the capacity of the solar equipment actually does not exceed the existing capacity of the connection to the distribution grid. So this is just a matter of ensuring, technical safety and security. But if this condition is met, then the 1 month deadline with this tacit approval applies. In some exceptional circumstances, the member states may decide to apply a lower threshold. So instead of 50 kilowatt installations, they may decide to lower this up to 10.8. So they have to be still higher than 10.8, the installations. But this has to be under very justified circumstances. So normally the rule should be really quick permitting for these very small scale installations of solar equipment. For repowering, I will just focus on the point of repowering of solar. So here there is an overview of what is the new deadlines and the new permitting. Overall, we impose a maximum 6 month deadline for the repowering of projects, so wind and solar, regardless of the technology. If there is the repowering of a big wind park or a wind or a solar park, it has to be done within 6 month deadline. The approvals, so the administrative processes have to be approved within this deadline. And in the case of the repowering of solar, which is something that may be interesting for you, we wanted to really simplify the environmental assessment. So if the repowering implies that you replace the solar panels by new ones, but without using any additional space, so if the solar park does not grow, it doesn't use new space, and the project complies with the original mitigation measures that were imposed, during the environmental check of the project, then this project will be also exempted, will not have to do an environmental impact assessment. So if you show that, look, I'm replacing the panels by new ones, these are very efficient, and I'm actually even reducing the size of the whole park or the whole installation, or at least I'm not increasing, I'm not using new space, then for these projects you don't need to do any sort of environmental check. So with that, we really try to streamline the environmental, at least the environmental part of the procedure. I will move now to the Renewable Energy Directive, which, as I said, is still in provisional agreement. But this text, actually, this directive, which will be enforced after the regulation that I just explained, it will expire. It will be valid for 18 months, so it will be in force until July 2024, so next year. So after that time, some of the provisions of this directive will enter into force. I just want to give a general picture of what will come in this revised directive. And this directive, the current one, actually the one that is already in force, already has some rules on permitting. It sets, for instance, a maximum deadline of 2 years for the procedures for new projects. Let's think of the new wind projects or new solar projects. But these 2 years today don't include the environmental assessment. So for the environmental assessments today, there is no maximum deadline. So of course, this actually delays a lot the procedures, because if there is no deadline, there is of course a tendency to actually prolong it. So with this revision, we are trying to do several things. One of them is imposing a maximum deadline, including the environmental assessments. But a very important point of this new directive will be spatial planning. So we are asking member states to do this mapping that I mentioned at the beginning. They have to look at the territory, and they have to basically say, look, I need by 2030 to meet the target of the renewables at the European Union, I need to contribute X%, or I need to have this new capacity of renewables. So what we want member states is to do a map translating these objectives into territory. So we want them to have a map and saying, we need this wind, we need this solar, we need these new technologies, etc., or even hybrids, and we want them to have an overview of the territory of where they're going to deploy these new projects. And for this, they have a deadline. And then within this big map, let's say we can call the big and the small map, within this big map, we also want them to identify specific areas that we are going to call renewable acceleration areas, where the permitting procedures can be very, very quick. So in these areas, it should be areas that they have to check and identify parts of the territory where the deployment of a specific technology is not going to have important environmental constraints. So that's why the permitting can be very, very fast, and the environmental checks can also be very, very fast. So this is more or less how it would look: the national territory with the big areas, the big map, and then the smaller renewable acceleration areas. And for these acceleration areas, there is no, they can decide which technologies they want to promote. There is an obligation to do it at least for one, but they can decide whether it's wind, whether it's solar, whether it's actually a combination of both, or whether they prefer to do it for other technologies. On this, there is no obligation. So it's up to the member states, depending, of course, of their characteristics and their possibilities. So just to briefly explain how these areas have to be identified. So there will be some conditions that member states need to respect. So for instance, they need to give priority. So as I said, it's areas where normally the environmental impacts have to be the lowest, so that the procedures can be very quick. So they have to give priority to areas which are already, heavily built, like transport corridors, or heavily, heavy infrastructure areas, or near motorways. So areas that are not, the middle of the forest, but areas which are already already where there could be synergies, let's say. So they should exclude protected areas, and in the case of wind, for example, they have to, well, watch out with the major bird migratory routes, because of course there are risks of collision with the wind turbines. And in the case of solar, well, they have to pay attention where there are more synergies with other activities and where there is less environmental risk. And for doing it, they have to use, of course, appropriate mapping tools. Then once they identify the areas, they see, look, in this area, I think there is good potential for solar, good potential for wind, and I think the environmental impacts are going to be low. Then they actually have to design, or they have to establish the rules that the projects in these areas have to comply with. So for instance, for solar parks, they have to say, well, you can install a solar park of up to this capacity, or if you combine it with agricultural activities, then you have to install the solar panels in this particular position, or you have to adopt these mitigation measures to actually compensate for the potential damage that you may do to the environment. And the same for wind. For wind, for example, you can impose rules such as or distance rules with the houses, or rules for the height of the turbines, or the rules that at certain moments of the year you have to stop the turbine because there are some possible, birds nesting, or these type of things. And then once they have done all these things, they have to do a strategic environmental assessment. It's something that is already under some environmental directives in the EU level. There is this concept of a strategic environmental assessment. But the main idea to pass here is that the idea is to replace the individual environmental assessment per project by this strategic assessment. So instead of doing environmental assessments per project, which is what is done now, this will be replaced by one very big strategic assessment that the member states will do, and that will be public, and then the public will be able to give their opinions. And this, the goal is to front load, so that what is done now at the micro level will actually be done at the macro level when designating the areas. So this is in this slide, and with this one I conclude. This is the summary of how the permitting rules will actually be in these territories, in the renewable acceleration areas and outside. So I will start with the renewable acceleration area, so with the second bullet point. Here we will have particularly short deadlines for projects and very simple environmental assessments. So as I said, since we are doing the macro level, the macro assessments and the macro strategic assessments, the environmental assessments per project can be very streamlined or can be even skipped. So the environmental impact assessment will be simply replaced by a very short screening of a very short duration. So the projects, they will have to be notified to an authority. The authority will just have to check the project and see if the project complies with all the rules and the measures that the member states have identified and prepared, the ones that I explained right now. So when the member states identify the areas, they have to impose these rules and measures. So the authorities will just have to check whether these are complied with, and if they are complied with, then they don't have to do any more environmental assessments, and then the project can be approved from the environmental perspective. There is an emergency brake. So if this screening identifies that a project may still give rise, to very unforeseen effects that nobody could have thought about when they were doing the strategic assessment of the plan and of the whole area, then there is still a possibility to of course, to do a sort of emergency brake, and then to introduce additional measures that the projects might need to comply with. So for wind and solar PV, the procedure will still be very light. So member states can still decide to not do a full environmental assessment of the project, but they need to ensure that there are appropriate, of course, mitigation or compensation measures if there are very negative impacts that the project will give rise to. And for the other technologies, however, so such as bioenergy or hydro or anything else, member states will have to do an environmental impact assessment. And this is based on the premise that bioenergy normally leads to higher environmental risks than wind and solar. But this is in a nutshell a bit the summary of what will be enforced afterwards. Of course, there are many details. I mean, there is a positive silence also in some cases in these renewable acceleration areas. The deadlines, as you see in the two yellow boxes, they will be very short. So we want that in renewable acceleration areas, the maximum deadline for the whole permitting process for new projects is 1 year. There is some exception for offshore projects because these are, of course, much more complex. But for new wind and solar or any other technology project, the deadline has to be 1 year for all the permits. And for the repowering of existing projects, this is even shorter, 6 months. And then outside this renewable acceleration area, so elsewhere in the territory, things can continue as until now. But again, we also impose maximum deadline, so a bit longer, so 2 years for new projects and 1 year for repowering, but still simplified compared to today. So with this, I finish my part of the presentation. I thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to answer if there are any questions.
First of all, thank you very much, Marta, for the interesting presentation. Now, if there are any further questions after the presentation, please do not hesitate to write them in the chat box. I will start with a question, Marta. They asked us like how is the European Commission encouraging citizen participation in such an accelerated renewables deployment?
Yes, so it is important that citizens are involved. We see that, well, first, as I mentioned, the first regulation that I explained focuses really a lot on small projects, solar, self-consumption, heat pumps. So this is an important thing to really facilitate that citizens can install their own solar panels at their home, and that they can actually participate and benefit directly from the benefits of renewables in their own places and in their own houses. So this is something that is being promoted. On the very big and macro projects, it's important that they really have a say on this strategic level planning. So we think it's really important to have this discussion with communities, with citizens, with all the towns that are going to be affected, by projects in certain areas. So it is important to give them a chance. So as part of this strategic assessment, there should be a public consultation process so that the public has the opportunity to comment, look, I don't like these rules or these measures that you impose because I think the distance of the projects to the houses is too short, or the height of the turbines, or these measures, or that they can give their view, and that at least there is a dialogue at the strategic or more macro level, and that citizens are involved there, because now the involvement only happens at the individual projects, but it's much better to have a more, let's say, strategic approach.
Thank you very much, Marta. I'll go with another question from Bernard. The question is the following. He says, in France, we have special permit if we are less than 600 meters of a historical building, even if the installation is not visible from the street. Do this simplified permit apply in this case?
Okay, we need more details of what type of project. So if it's like what type of technology? So I understand 600 meters from historical buildings.
Exactly, that's what the attendee said.
I mean, what I can say is that the regulation that is currently applying, so this really targeted one, mainly focuses on projects on artificial structures. So it wouldn't really cover projects that are being put next to the historical buildings, but rather on the buildings. And one may think, okay, does this mean that the Coliseum or other historical buildings now will have solar panels? Well, no. I mean, this is just a short deadline that authorities can, of course, refuse the permit. If someone wants to put solar panels on a historical building, the authorities can still say no. They just have to say no faster. But there are some exceptions. So member states may introduce exceptions in their national systems due to historical and cultural heritage reasons precisely. So they may decide to prolong the deadline, and I put a bit of a longer deadline if they think this is important for reasons of preservation of heritage or these type of things. But normally this should be limited.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have another question from Nabil. He the question is the following. It says, roughly, what are your expectations for the increase in solar PV in the first 6 months period, accounting for at least 2 months preparation of an application?
2-month preparation of application for the permit, or I mean, I don't have
Maybe,
figures
yeah.
right now, but I mean, and we are actually, what I can say is that we are monitoring the way that these provisions are being implemented, but I'm afraid in terms of visibility and deployment of figures, I don't have figures or projections right now, because this is really too new.
Okay, perfect. We have another question from Adebayo. It's does the accelerating of permits apply to small wind turbines such as 5 kilowatt for home use?
Of wind turbines?
Yes, wind turbines. Exactly.
Yes, so the rules on accelerating applies to everything. Of course, in the regulation that is now in force, wind is not really a technology that is targeted. So we target mostly solar on artificial structures, we target heat pumps, we target repowering. So wind is not covered, but in the renewable acceleration areas and in the future, provisions of the directive, all technologies are included and all capacities, of course, but with the very small capacities, there are special rules that are even simpler and faster. So that I can say already. So it doesn't matter the technology, but if there is very, very small capacity and very small thresholds, those are even simpler.
Perfect. I just have a clarification from our question before about the historical buildings. Bernard says that he meant an installation on a building that is close to a historical building.
Mm-hmm. As I said, there is the possibility for member states to introduce some, longer procedures for reasons of cultural or historical heritage. Of course, it would be for member states to see if this only applies to the actual historical building or if it applies to all the buildings that are surrounding a certain perimeter of the historical buildings. I mean, in some cases, it make sense that you do it also for those that are really next door to the historical building, but this is really up to the member states. There is flexibility. So if in France, they think that they need to put a bit of a longer deadline for this, maybe they can do it, but this is really up to the member states. So it's more, this is too specific for European legislation.
Perfect. And I would say just one last question from one of our attendees, which is what is the expected timeline for this revised Renewable Energy Directive?
Yes, so it is still being discussed and negotiated. I mean, the negotiations are finalizing, but it still needs to be approved and it still needs to go to a legal revision process, we call it. So we hope that this process is going to be finished in the next months, ideally. Well, of course, with the summer break, it's always a bit more challenging. But in the next months, the revised directive should enter into force, ideally September, but if not, the last quarter of the year, it should be adopted.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Marta. I see one last question, and I think, it's again from Nabil. He's asking how do you intend to enforce grid capacity uptake to cope with the increased planning applications?
Yes. So grids is something I didn't really focus on grids now in the presentation, but I can just mention that in the regulation that is in force now, the temporary one, but also in the future directive, there are articles to accelerate also permitting for the grids, to really allow member states to expand the grid capacity faster. So there is some streamlining of environmental assessments, and there are some rules to have similar areas as for renewables, the renewable acceleration areas, to have something similar also for the grid. To really try to go both hand in hand, because I mean, you cannot, if you accelerate renewables but the grid doesn't grow, of course we are not advancing much. So there are also some provisions for the grid.
Okay, perfect. In the last minute, one last question came. This one will be really the last. It's do the new simplification help for storage battery installation inside a building in order to improve auto consumption?
Yes, indeed. I should have mentioned that on the solar installations on artificial structures, this also affects the co-located storage. So all the storage that you would also put together with your solar panels, it would also be part of these shorter deadlines. Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you very much, Marta, for the presentation and for all answering all the questions from our attendees. In case any of you has further questions, please do not hesitate to contact any of us. We'll be happy to answer them after the webinar in the coming days. Also, I would like to mention that you will be receiving the recording of the webinar tomorrow. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you will have access also to the webinar in our website and also to webinars that will help before. So Marta, again, thank you very much for your time and for the interesting presentation. And thanks.
Thank you. I hope it was clear.